Homosexuality is unholy and repugnant to Jehovah, and he will not tolerate it among his dedicated servant.
As she studies them, she becomes aroused to the point of engaging in self-abuse.
Two brothers masturbate in front of each other, but without touching each other. Is it porneia?
When I was a kid, I wanted to go to Bethel. Bethel is a center of the Jehovah's Witness religion with multiple branches around the world, where young and strong volunteers go to make the multimedia used for their religion, organize the ins and outs of the preaching work, and, if you're a woman, keep everything spotlessly clean. And just like any other big corporation, Bethel has made an introduction video to show new recruits the main things they need to take into account. These videos were never meant to be seen by you or me. They were made specifically for internal communications, and that's why these videos are so insightful. When new recruits arrive, they're segregated into men and women, and each will be shown only one of these videos. Ralph Waltz is in charge of the video made for women, that's 20 minutes long, and Gary Breaux is in charge of the video made for men, that's almost twice as long, probably because the people making this material are men, so they have twice as much to say about men. But as you can see, the spirit of the talk is basically the same.
Satan's world delights in practices that can make us unclean and unfit in Jehovah's eyes, even in seemingly small ways. Unless we take strong measures, we will be influenced by the world, even in subtle ways. The spirit of the world is powerful. So, how can we maintain our clean standing before Jehovah?
Satan's world loves practices that Jehovah hates and promotes them as completely normal. Frankly, we might be drawn to some of those things. The question is, what do you have to do to keep yourself clean before Jehovah? The governing body loves you and wants you to experience the great joy that comes from serving Jehovah with a clean conscience.
These opening remarks are basically false equivalences, and those are what's going to support the whole speech. They're about to talk about things that are not in the Bible, but since Jehovah is basically the governing body, and since the governing body decided that these things are sins, any Bible verse that condemns sins can basically be applied to their topic. It's like if I decided wearing yellow was a sin and read you a supporting verse that said how much God hates sinning to prove my point.
There's no reason to be embarrassed about what we're going to discuss. You need to understand these matters to keep clean before Jehovah and enjoy his blessing.
It feels like Gary here is projecting. He probably knows this is the most embarrassing speech he'll ever give, so he's trying to gaslight you, being like, no, you are embarrassed. Let's see why Gary is so worried.
Dress and grooming is important for all of Jehovah's people, but for those serving at Bethel, it is especially important that thought be given in this area. Brothers and sisters, parents and young ones, look to the worldwide Bethel family as examples of modest dress and grooming. Dear sisters, please avoid short skirts or dresses above the knee, tight-fitting, revealing, low-cut, or otherwise immodest clothing. If you do not give thought to what you wear and how you groom, you will likely be influenced by the world's fashions. This applies not only when at meetings, but also during times that allow for more casual dress and when we're working in our assignments.
The first item on the agenda is dress and grooming. And notice how Ralph said it doesn't just involve your work inside of the cult compound, but it also involves your leisure time. A Bethelite cannot be seen wearing skirts above the knee, or cleavage, or any other clothes that would be considered sexy by the standards of a conservative man from 1965, not even in their own private time when they're not in the compound. And why? Well, because of sex.
Why should you sisters be particularly mindful of this? Because such immodest dress can be harmful to Christian brothers and even some sisters. Clothes today are designed to sexually excite others, to make the wearer sexy. We're certain that none of you would intentionally desire to make it more difficult for brothers to resist unclean thoughts. Realistically, you must recognize that generally, men are more affected by the desire of the eyes as respects physical attraction. One young man said, "I personally find it rather hard to think only pure thoughts about younger women when I see the way they dress."
That man should not be allowed to interact in society. But if you think misogyny is bad, how about we sprinkle a little bit of homophobia on top? Whoops, the lid came off. Here's all the homophobia.
Let's see 3 ways in which Jehovah's Word helps you to keep your personal habits clean. The first way you can do this is by avoiding tight-fitting clothes that can identify you with homosexuality. What kind of clothes are we talking about? Some outfits are designed to feminize a man's appearance, as homosexuals try to do, especially displaying the buttocks and genitals. Why? Because it makes it harder to tell the difference between a homosexual and a heterosexual man, making homosexuals blend in. So these clothes contribute to changing people's opinion of homosexuality because they come to see it as normal and acceptable. We know that you never intentionally promote that practice, but the question is, how would Jehovah view a man that serves him while dressed in a way that identifies him with homosexuality?
Gary just said that wearing tight pants promotes homosexuality by allowing the homosexuals who also wear tight pants to blend in. Honestly, this would be extremely offensive if it wasn't extremely stupid. But it doesn't matter how stupid your example is, as long as it supports your point, as Ralph is about to demonstrate.
The Watchtower, back in December 1961, had a question from readers that asked, "How can girls guard against temptation in this sex-crazy world?" The Watchtower said this: "It is interesting to note that the male animal has no season in which he is not willing to engage in the breeding act. If we humans would take a lesson from these creatures, we would learn something of importance in matters of sex as to its purpose and the results of its operation." End of quote. Men are generally more easily aroused. The August 1st, 1969 Watchtower said, "Christian women have the obligation not to dress provocatively, not to tempt men to keep looking at them, and so reap a prideful pleasure in noting how they're able to play upon the emotions of men." So, using your power of reason, you must realize that Satan's system molds the fashion industry so that the clothing worn by women will excite men.
Oh, you thought I was exaggerating earlier when I said their views come from the standards of a conservative man from 1965? As Ralph just demonstrated, that's not even hyperbole. That's just a fact. And we're just getting started.
The God's Love book explains that masturbation is the stroking or rubbing of the genital organs, commonly resulting in an orgasm. So, does a person have to use their hands to masturbate? For example, say a brother wears an undergarment that's so tight it rubs his penis as he moves around. He gets aroused and even ejaculates. Is he masturbating? Yes, he is, because he's deliberately stimulating his genitals, even though he's not using his hands.
This puzzling example that Gary just shared with us kickstarts the trend we'll see of him sharing extremely specific examples. The first time I heard this, I could not believe what I was hearing. I was also looking for these boxers that apparently give you a handy, but I quickly realized the sad implication of it. As you'll continue to see, unless you're doing it in a straight marriage, you cannot have any sexual contact whatsoever. It's like No Nut November, but as a lifestyle. And when you're deprived of sexual contact for that long, it gets to a point where your boxers aren't the only thing that will get you off.
Does there have to be an orgasm for it to be considered masturbation? Suppose a brother starts rubbing his genitals against a pillow. He gets an erection, but stops before having an orgasm. Is he masturbating? Yes, again, because he's deliberately stimulating himself, whether he has an orgasm or not.
That's right. Imagine how sexually deprived you have to be so a pillow can get you off. Remember, Gary's only speaking to men here, and he's letting them know that they'll be so sexually deprived that a pillow may set them off. And they can't even keep their guard down when they sleep.
How about having an emission of semen at night, maybe even after an erotic dream? Is that masturbation? No. Jehovah made that a part of a man's reproductive system, and it happens without any deliberate stimulation. But even so, when this happens to you, it would be good to examine whether you were dwelling on sexual thoughts before going to sleep. Could you have been sleeping in a position that stimulated you, such as with a blanket or pillow held tightly between your legs?
It's sad that Gary has to talk about wet dreams and give permission for men to not feel guilty about it. Or, well, not too guilty, as even then you have to self-examine whether or not the dream really came from your subconscious only and not because you are actively thinking the wrong thing before going to sleep. This is a great time to remind you that masturbation isn't in the Bible. And not because the Bible doesn't go into specifics. It literally goes further into how not to cook lamb than it goes into masturbation. That's why Gary needs to use false equivalences to get the Bible to agree with him.
What effect does masturbation have on a person's sacred service? 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1 explains what Jehovah expects of us. Therefore, since we have these promises, beloved ones, let us cleanse ourselves of every defilement of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. So Jehovah wants us to cleanse ourselves of anything that defiles our spirit. In other words, anything that contaminates our mental attitude. Masturbation contaminates a man with selfishness, it weakens his self-control, and it makes him believe that sex doesn't have to be related to love. It also fills a Christian with guilt. Trying to keep your service to Jehovah holy while under the influence of masturbation is like trying to climb a mountain with a large boulder that you're carrying. Until you free yourself of it, it can only hold you back. What have you done to cultivate a deep disgust for this practice so as to keep yourself clean?
So masturbation is like a boulder because? False equivalences are the bread and butter of spiritual food. But what's Ralph telling the woman about masturbation?
The next area of concern is a more sensitive matter. That is to resist the unclean habit of self-abuse or masturbation. This involves the deliberate stimulation of the genital organs. Don't let yourself become contaminated by this unclean habit.
Well, basically more of the same. Now they're both going to give us the same specific advice to avoid falling prey to the influence of masturbation.
Pornography in any form is not tolerated at Bethel. What can you do to guard yourself against becoming contaminated with pornography, even by accident? Take precautions to keep yourself as far away from its path as possible. Think of the following situation.
A sister views a list of recommended pictures and videos displayed by a social media application. Maybe it's installed on her phone.
While in the bathroom, a brother starts browsing through a list of recommended pictures and videos on a social media app on his phone.
She comes across some provocative pictures.
He comes across provocative pictures of men or women. Some may be topless and some may be nude.
She doesn't open the pictures.
He doesn't tap on them, but he does keep looking and starts to masturbate.
But she lingers over what they call thumbnail images, which are small images reduced in size. As she studies them, she becomes aroused to the point of engaging in self-abuse.
Now, did this brother truly stumble upon pornography by accident? Or could it be that he was browsing in a place where he actually hoped to find something sexually arousing?
Anyone can happen upon pornography accidentally. This world has made it easy for that to happen. But if one intentionally practices exposing oneself to such harmful images, that may lead to such uncleanness.
Either way, he needs to examine himself honestly, don't you think? Maybe it would be best for him not to use the internet while isolated from others. What precautions can you take to avoid such a situation?
So don't use your phone on the toilet because you may end up getting too excited with the thumbnails.
Which are small images reduced in size.
And the good advice just keeps coming.
Suppose a brother is watching a TV program for mature audiences that contains a sex scene. Now, the scene is shot from an angle so that you can't see the intimate parts of either person. But he replays it several times and gets aroused. Is he keeping himself clean from the influence of pornography? There may not be any visible nudity, but that scene is definitely designed to arouse the person viewing it, and that's why he's viewing it over and over. He needs to work on hating what is bad. What steps do you take to avoid entertainment that could lead you to pornography?
That's right, you can't even watch censored PG-13 movies if there's a sex scene in it. And this is all biblical, by the way.
Neither go on presenting your bodies to sin as weapons of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, also your bodies to God as weapons of righteousness. Did you notice that a person can present their body to sin, or they can present it to Jehovah, but not both at the same time? If a Christian deliberately presents his eyes to pornography, any worship he renders to Jehovah, no matter how hard he works with the rest of his body, is no longer holy.
False equivalences will get you a long way if your audience isn't allowed to contradict you. But there's something even more dangerous than being under the influence of masturbation.
Now, what would you describe as flirting? Put simply, it's treating someone as if you're interested in marriage when you're really not.
It can involve using flattering speech or provocative body language towards someone with no intention of pursuing an honorable, romantic relationship or not being in a circumstance to pursue a romantic relationship.
How can you tell the difference between just displaying personal interest, pursuing an honorable courtship, and flirting? Well, a lot depends on what your intentions are.
For example, a sister compliments a brother on the way he is dressed for work.
A single brother compliments an outgoing single commuter sister on the way she dresses at work.
On another occasion, she mentions his new haircut.
On another occasion, he mentions her new hairstyle.
And from time to time, she sends him a text message to check to see that he's arrived home safely.
From time to time, he sends her a text message to check that she arrived home safely. Is he just displaying personal interest? His comments go beyond being concerned for her well-being, don't they?
Now, such actions on the part of a married sister or a single sister towards a married man are totally inappropriate and lead to disastrous consequences.
He's even telling her that he finds her attractive. She would definitely be justified in concluding that he has romantic interest in her. Is he flirting? If he's actually interested in a possible courtship, his actions may not be wrong. But if not, he would reasonably be viewed as flirting.
If the sister and brother are single, what should she consider? That this brother would be justified in concluding that she has a romantic interest in him. And if she is not interested in pursuing the courtship, she's flirting. And that's damaging.
Yup, flirting is complimenting people every now and then and texting them to make sure that they arrived home safely. And since Jehovah's Witness can only date if they want to marry that person, then there's no excuse for flirting with anybody you're not intending to marry. If you're wondering how the hell bethelites are supposed to have friends of the opposite gender, they're not.
Flirting is cruel and dangerous. It is a form of lying that disregards Jehovah's counsel. The Bible is very plain in its expressions on lying. Proverbs 12:22 says, "Lying lips are detestable to Jehovah." Is it possible that a sister could let her guard down with a married brother? Here's a circumstance where that could happen. A young sister is taken in or adopted by a married couple. The husband, who may be older, hugs her affectionately in public and views her as his little sister. She visits their room often and feels very comfortable talking to the brother about her concerns. The sister feels that they are like family. There's nothing wrong with such relationships. In fact, they can have a wholesome, nurturing effect. Expressions of affection toward others vary greatly in different cultures. However, good discernment and judgment must be exercised. Please be mindful that hugging, stroking, and kissing a brother on the cheek may be intended to convey wholesome love. But keep in mind that marriage does not make the brother immune from becoming emotionally attached or sexually aroused. And if you feel a particularly strong emotional attachment to the brother, it can lead to trouble. If you are a married sister, your husband has the right to expect that he is your closest confidant and the sole object of your romantic attention. Of course, there's a need for balance. Exercising appropriate caution does not mean that you should be stiff and aloof around members of the opposite sex, married or single.
How could you possibly be anything but stiff with members of the opposite sex after this? This is exactly what Jehovah's Witnesses commonly do to keep followers on their toes. They tell them a whole bunch of ways that an action can be wrong, but they never show a single example of the action being right, so the followers often simply avoid doing that action altogether to avoid any issues. And that's definitely what's going to happen with anyone in Bethel watching this.
Consider a situation. A group of single brothers has a meal together, and after most leave, two of them remain behind in the room drinking alcohol. At one point, one asks the other if he has ever woken up with an erection. Their conversation starts to touch on sexual matters. Are they flirting? Their conversation can arouse sexual desires in them, even though they're of the same sex. This could easily lead to comments or curiosity about each other's bodies. Don't deceive yourself thinking this could never happen. Keep in mind that alcohol tends to lower your inhibitions and can make thoughts that you'd normally suppress or view as repulsive seem acceptable, even inviting.
Gary, did this happen in Bethel? Are your extremely specific examples all real memories from working at the service department? This isn't the first of the very many very specific examples Gary brings out, and it just makes me feel like these are all real cases from real people under real sexual repression.
What if a sister is married? Should you feel you can be more affectionate with a married sister than you would with one who's single? For example, a young single brother is adopted by a couple at Bethel, and he regularly spends time with them. The wife, who's 4 or 5 years older, hugs him affectionately in public and views him as her little brother. He goes to their room frequently, even when the husband isn't there. and he feels comfortable talking to the sister, even about his problems. He claims they're like family. Is this appropriate? No, this is dangerous. Neither one of them is immune to becoming emotionally attached to the person who is dedicating so much time and attention to them. Of course, there is nothing wrong with becoming friends with more mature couples at Bethel. But keep in mind that a married person belongs to their mate. A sister's husband has the right to expect that he will be her closest friend and the only one giving her romantic attention.
Gary mentions adopting again because, as you can tell, living in a cult compound for years at a time with these harsh rules leads to dysfunctional relationships being born out of necessity. Jehovah's Witnesses usually start dating in their late teens because they aren't allowed to date earlier, and they marry in their early 20s because they aren't allowed to have sex outside of marriage, which surprisingly leads to marriages that aren't great. Now imagine what happens when you've been in a marriage with a person you don't really like that much, and a new and attractive bethelite comes in and it's a better fit for you than your spouse, which is already a low bar. Especially when they are the only person from the opposite sex you're allowed to be friends with.
What if you're married? Being married does not give a brother permission to be overly affectionate with sisters other than his wife. You, too, need to be on guard to avoid even giving the impression of flirting. What does Jehovah think of flirting? Go to Proverbs 12, verse 22, please. Lying lips are detestable to Jehovah, but those acting faithfully bring pleasure to him. Really, flirting is lying. It's a cruel and dangerous form of lying that disregards Jehovah's counsel about marriage. He hates it, so it's important for you to see it the same to remain holy.
Since the Bible, again, says nothing about flirting, Gary has to make a false equivalence here between flirting and lying so he can pretend the Bible agrees with him. What else can bethelites do?
Sexting can mean sending sexually explicit messages or even improper photos or videos by some electronic means.
Sexting in the world is common, particularly among young people. This involves sending sexually explicit messages, images, or pictures. How can this happen among Jehovah's people?
While video chatting with his girlfriend, they start making some references to sexual subjects.
A sister video chats with her boyfriend. As they draw closer, their conversation turns to discussing sexual subjects. They are progressively more unclean, becoming sexually explicit, perhaps even sending provocative photographs. Both need assistance from the elders.
He ends up becoming aroused, and after they finish their conversation, he masturbates. The next time they speak, the conversation goes further and becomes sexually explicit. Now, both start masturbating while connected, but without exposing themselves to one another. Now, obviously, at this point, both need to get help from the elders because their conversations are becoming more and more unclean. They're on the express route to sexual immorality.
If they develop a practice of engaging in immoral conversations that involve obscene speech or gross uncleanness, such conduct might be a basis for judicial action. Judicial action refers to a situation where a serious violation of God's laws has occurred and a judgment needs to be made to determine whether the individual qualifies to continue as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. How sad for matters to reach that point.
But what should he have done to be on guard and not let things get to this point? At 1 Timothy 5, verse 2, Paul told Timothy to treat all his Christian sisters with all chasteness. You need to do the same, especially towards a sister you have a romantic interest in. Be aware of the danger and keep your conversations clean. Make spiritual matters a regular part of your communication. Avoid communicating late at night when you might be more likely to let your guard down. In doing so, you demonstrate that you're a spiritual man capable of caring for your prospective mate's relationship with Jehovah.
That's right, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you can't even send sexy messages to your partner. I find it interesting how Ralph only talks a bit about sexting and mentions how sad it would be that two people exchanged messages of a sexual nature because that would mean the elders need to discipline them. However, Gary talks about sexual content as soon as he can, and he seems to go into far more detail than he needs to. I may be biased because I unironically like Ralph. I think he probably gives really good hugs. But whereas Ralph comes off as a dad trying to talk about an uncomfortable situation, Gary seems to enjoy this speech. Going into so much detail, his speech ends up being almost twice as long, despite clearly being based on the same outline. Just look into how they both define the word porneia.
In recent years, we've been helped by the faithful and discreet slave to have a clear understanding of what is involved in the Bible's use of the word porneia, or fornication. It relates to sexual relations involving persons not married to each other and includes acts such as oral sex, anal sex, and manipulating or fondling another person's genitals. There can be porneia even if there is no skin-to-skin contact.
Porneia is sexual relations involving persons not married to each other. It includes acts such as oral sex, anal sex, and masturbating another person. It always involves deliberate manipulation of the genitals and at least one other person or animal. When a Christian commits porneia, the elders always have to provide assistance. Do the genitals of both need to be manipulated for there to be porneia, such as when two people have sexual intercourse? No, both oral sex and anal sex involve the manipulation of the genitals of only one person.
When Paul was condemning sexual immorality, he happened to use the Greek word porneia. And while virtually any other person will consider sexual immorality for what's immoral, Jehovah's Witnesses have a Pharisaical view of Scripture, so they go into extreme detail of what a specific word means and how that can be applied to subdue Christians today. After all, if they can find proof even when there's none, imagine what they can do even if there's a slither of proof. And as we're about to find out, going into masturbatory detail on what a word means can lead to pretty wacky outcomes.
For example, if a couple are courting and become passionately inflamed, and he lies on top of his girlfriend, and they simulate sexual intercourse, even with clothes on, this constitutes porneia.
Does manipulation of the genitals always involve the use of the hands? Not necessarily. For example, suppose a brother pays a stripper to perform a lap dance that lasts several minutes. She grinds her clothed genitals on his leg while he's fully clothed. He becomes aroused, but doesn't ejaculate. Was that porneia? His genitals aren't being manipulated, and he's not touching the woman's genitals with his hands. However, he is committing porneia by allowing her to use his leg to stimulate her own genitals. Can there be porneia without skin-to-skin contact? Say a brother lies down on top of his girlfriend while both are clothed, and they simulate having sex. Are they committing porneia? They have their clothes on, but the genitals of both are being manipulated, so they've committed porneia whether a climax is reached or not. That means that even some provocative forms of dancing, such as when a man rhythmically rubs his pelvis against the buttocks of a woman as she rubs herself against him, can also amount to porneia. What if a person fondles the genitals of another but doesn't actually masturbate them? For example, a brother sits on the lap of one of his male friends. His friend puts his arm around his waist and at one point fondles his crotch over his clothes. Is that porneia? Although the second man didn't go as far as masturbating the first, he is deliberately stimulating his genitals. Because there's fondling, caressing, stroking, or rubbing involved, this act constitutes porneia. What are the following situation? Two brothers masturbate in front of each other, but without touching each other. Is it porneia? The answer is no, since neither is touching the other person. However, it is a flagrant disregard for Jehovah's laws and a serious sin that has to be addressed by the elders.
So having a lap dance while both people are fully clothed is porneia. But two men masturbating in front of each other isn't porneia, and this makes sense.
Out of love, we find it necessary to be so clear on what Jehovah has set as standards. Although Satan has managed to influence the world's thinking on the subject of sexual immorality and even of homosexuality, Jehovah's view has not changed. That is why we want to emphasize the need to follow Paul's inspired advice. Stop being molded by this system of things.
To keep clean before Jehovah, you have to fight against homosexual behavior. You've surely noticed that we've mentioned several situations involving homosexuality throughout this talk. Why do you think that is? Satan is desperately promoting this perverted practice. It's no exaggeration to say that he's flooded his world with propaganda in favor of homosexuality. It's not realistic to think that you can't be affected by his efforts just because you serve at Bethel. At times, you may find yourself struggling with same-sex desires, or you may realize that others are doing so. That doesn't mean that you or they are homosexuals, but it does mean that you have to keep on guard to remain holy.
Yep, we're diving fully into homophobia. And while Ralph is done with the topic, Gary's about to give you some insight into how to fight the gay away, and how the gays shouldn't go looking around in the communal showers, as we all know they love doing.
Examine your conduct carefully and honestly so that you avoid situations that can foster homosexual desires. For example, do you avoid unnecessarily exposing yourself to others, such as when you're in the locker room? Are you always modest, even in front of your roommates? Do you have the habit of excessively touching other brothers, hugging them tightly, slapping their buttocks, rubbing them, giving them massages, and so on? Of course, at Bethel, you may sometimes have to use a community shower, and that means you may not be able to completely avoid being briefly undressed in front of other brothers. In some cultures, it may be acceptable for two men to walk hand in hand, or local customs may permit the use of saunas while unclothed. But if you find yourself struggling with same-sex desires, it would be wise to honestly examine whether you need to make adjustments in your conduct with other brothers. Proverbs 6, verse 27 asks, "Can a man rake fire to his chest and not burn his garments?" The answer is no. Thus, to keep yourself clean from homosexual desires, you cannot put yourself in situations that could bring them to your heart. For instance, what do you think of the following situation? After exercising together, two single brothers go back to shower in a room. Afterwards, one gives the other, who's wearing only a towel, a massage. One or both of them get sexually aroused. They have put themselves in an extremely dangerous situation, don't you agree?
Again, just false equivalences and extremely specific examples of people struggling to successfully repress their sexuality, especially when it's one of the icky ones.
Although Satan is waging war to influence people's thinking on the subject of homosexuality, Jehovah hasn't changed his view on the matter. Homosexuality is unholy and repugnant to Jehovah, and he will not tolerate it among his dedicated servants. Does your love for Jehovah move you to have the same view?
This has to be one of the most misogynist, repressive, and homophobic videos ever produced by the Jehovah's Witnesses. These videos are made to address the issues that come up when you repress and oppress people to the point where they have to worry about what they're thinking as they fall asleep. They could be as silent on masturbation as the Bible is, but instead, they decide that masturbation is wrong, and the first thing that bethelites should encounter is an anti-porn and anti-masturbation video. It shows the pharisaical approach of Jehovah's Witnesses to the Bible, combined with sexual purity BS and homophobia. You can almost see the panic of Watchtower when they keep getting issues from people being sexually repressed to the point that it's the first thing they feel they need to bring up to new recruits. But instead of making fun of Gary, Ralph, or even the Bethelites, I hope this helps you to be compassionate with Jehovah's Witnesses. This is the level of control the religion expects of them. And witnesses truly believe that it's for their own good. This causes a ton of problems in their lives and makes them feel unworthy when they can't successfully repress themselves. This video reminded me of my teenage years while indoctrinated and the nightmarishly terrible time I had with sexual repression. I want to give special thanks to my source, who asked to remain anonymous, and to my Patreons who are making it possible for me to post more often. Thank you for watching.